Right, good day grade 12s. In the previous two videos we looked at direct material cost and then direct labor cost, and those two together added up to give us our prime cost or our direct costs. So in this one I'm going to go on now and I'm going to look at the third of our cost components, and that's our factory overhead costs. Now those are factory overhead costs, is all those costs that are associated with the factory. In other words, they happen in the factory, but they're not directly involved in the manufacturing process. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is that on your answer sheet for this, you were given the total for the factory overhead costs. That figure was actually given to you. So, in other words, if we go to our factory overhead cost note, that figure is our final figure over here, 654,310. It was given to you at the top in the production cost statement, and that therefore is the total of the factory overheads, and we'll see why that is just now. The other thing to notice that is on your factory overhead costs, they did write in factory foreman salary. Now if we have a look at our actual exercise where we looked at labor, which we've already done, they spoke about the direct labor, and there was nothing mentioned here about a foreman's salary. So we'll have to look and see if they'll give us somewhere else. Right, information 3 gives us our indirect material, and take note, it's called indirect materials. That's things like consumable stores, things that are used in the factory like cleaning materials, for example, but they don't form a direct part of the product. The product's not made up of them, but they are essential in order to maintain the factory. So indirect materials purchase cost 17,600. Now before I look any further, we need to just take note that in your opening balances you were given a stock of indirect materials. Just like you're given a stock of consumable stores, which you've dealt with before, or a stock of packing materials or stock of stationery, it's all the same principle. So in other words, we're starting off the year and we've already got indirect materials here. We started the year with 2,300. It then told me that I purchased another 17,600. So I'll add on what I've purchased. And very importantly, they're working on the periodic stock system, so exactly the same as what you did with the direct material. At the end of the year, you had 2,100 still on hand. Now, if you've still got those on hand, you haven't used them, so they can't be a cost for this year. So we'll have to subtract the 2,100 in order to find the actual cost of what we used of indirect materials. And then let's just finish reading before we do any more calculations. It says 70% of indirect materials are used in the factory, and the balance is used equally in the admin and the selling and distribution departments. Now just hold that thought about selling and admin. I'm going to come back to those ones just now. The admin is like the office. The selling is the department that sells the goods. This has got nothing to do with the factory. They are different departments. And at this stage, I'm looking at factory overhead. So only 70% of this is actually used by the factory. Now, what's very important is that it's of the total indirect materials that we've used. The biggest mistake that is made is learners take the 17,600 that was bought and work out 70% of that. Now that's incorrect. It's 70% of the amount you've used. So you've got to calculate what the cost of the indirect materials or consumable stores was, and then work out 70% of that, which comes to 12,460. Now make a note of that if you did that wrong. Right, our next adjustment or additional information was given to us was to do with rent, electricity and water. Now it says the rent, electricity and water are shared according to the floor space used. Namely, There was 650 square meters for the factory, 210 square meters for the admin, and 140 square meters for the selling and distribution. Again, take note that this is not all factory. Some of it's got to go to the admin department and some's going to come to the selling and distribution. At this stage, as again, same as what I did just now, I'm looking only at the factory just in this particular video. So we're going to have to get a ratio here. And what they told me is that the factory is using 650 square meters of the total space they've got. The admin uses 210 and selling and distribution is 140. If you add that up, therefore there's 1,000 square meters here. Now the rent expense is 450,000. So the factory uses 650 of the 1,000 times by the 450,000. Now you either do it here, and remember though, you show your workings, but I'm just trying to show you all this. Otherwise, we go into the factory overheads and we put in our rent. Our rent, the factory is using 650 of the total of 1,000. You have to add up that 1,000 times 450,000. So the factory is not responsible for the total rent, and so the factory uses 292,500 of the rent. Now the electricity and water is done exactly the same. Electricity and water, it's still the same. They use the same 650 of the 1,000 square meters. The total expense was 275,000, and so the electricity and water that goes to the factory, 178,750. Now before you go on any further, make sure that you understand this ratio. It is something that you do in maths and maths literacies, and you've been doing it for many years, so just draw back on your maths knowledge. Right. Adjustment number 5 says insurance for the factory amounted to 35,000. So there's no calculation here. That whole amount goes into factory overhead because it's all for the factory. And then depreciation, which is an expense, remember, is written off as follows. Now the factory machinery will be part of the factory overhead. The office equipment, that cost will go to the admin cost, and on the depreciation on the delivery vehicle will go to the selling and distribution. And so therefore it's just bringing in the insurance and the depreciation on the factory machinery. Those are just straight copying figures. Now if you have a look at this factory overhead costs, remember I said to you at the beginning we were given factory foreman salary and nothing more has been said about it. If you carry on reading in the exercise, there is nothing here said about the foreman salary. But they gave us the details, so that was the clue. They've told us that this all has to add up to 654310. And if you take your calculator and you add this up at the moment, you'll find it does not come to that. There's an amount short. And whatever that shortfall is, in actual fact 108,000 is the foreman's salary. So you were given the total, you add up everything you've got and find the difference, and that gives you your factory overhead costs. Now of course obviously we're not going to transfer this back into our production cost statement, because at this stage our production cost statement already showed the 654310. But what we can do at this stage is to get our total manufacturing costs at this stage. And our total manufacturing costs at this stage, we've added those two up there to get the prime cost. We've got our factory overheads, and so our total costs for this year, which if we add up 1,500,710, that's taking the prime cost and your factory overhead costs. Right, that's the first half of the production cost statement, and so I'm going to stop there, and then in the next video I'm going to do the work in progress with you.